Welcome, everyone. Today, I have a special treat for you. I'm joined by none other than Damien, Manuel, and Mike Trovato, two highly respected cybersecurity professionals in Australia that have sat on the board of the Australian Information Security Association for many years. And they've accepted to come and have a discussion about AISA's historical stance on professionalization. And so today's discussion is really for AISA members. We're here to share what's happened in the last 10 years and what these two board members have witnessed and what their ideas about professionalizations might be. So I'd like to begin with a short intro. Damien, could you introduce yourself in just a few words for those who maybe have not had the chance to meet you before?
Sure. Thanks, Benjamin. My name's Damien Manuel. I was on the AISA board for 9 years, chair of the AISA board for 7 of those 9 years. Prior to that, I was the branch chair for Melbourne, and I ran that for a couple of years as well.
Excellent. And what about you, Mike?
Thanks, Ben, for asking me to join you and Damien on this. My name is Mike Trovato. You can tell from my American accent, I'm from the U.S. My career spans essentially, the U.S. and Australia. I came to Australia to be NAB's first group level GM of IT risk and security in 2003, and I'm basically a career consultant. At least 3/4 of my career has been in consulting, mostly in the Big Four, in the United States and in Australia, across Asia. And then essentially the other aspect of it has been in financial services primarily. I have a range of professional certifications, and upon coming to Australia, I was introduced to AISA, and several leaders from the financial services industry encouraged me to participate in it, and I found it to be a good organization that sort of tied together the community in Australia, at which point was a much smaller community, so I've been basically on the journey with AISA probably maybe 2 years or a year after it started, something like that. So I was an AISA board member for 6 years. I joined AISA just after they had their governance contretemps. I was an ISACA chapter board member, and I reached out to Damien and said, what can we do to help? Because, when problems happen, the community needs to pull together. And that was how I ended up on the AISA board.
Great, thank you. When I did the research for this discussion, I tried to pull public documents or statements that AISA had put out regarding professionalization. And I discovered a document dating back to 2016 where AISA had a plan of professionalizing the industry and releasing some sort of accreditation. So Damien, I'd like to begin with you. Could you tell us a bit about what was happening in 2016 and what problem was AISA wanting to solve with this accreditation?
Okay, so that was at the time where AISA, the chair of AISA effectively was Arno Brock, back in 2016. So he then became the CEO of AISA. Effectively, they were looking at a model of how do they increase a revenue stream for AISA, because fundamentally AISA was really dependent at that stage on membership dues, and that was kind of the funding mechanism for AISA. So Arno at the time was looking at a way for AISA to move into other areas to increase the financial viability of the association at that point in time.
Well, so Damien, if I understand properly, the motivation behind this at the time was to generate income. Was there another motivation? Like, were they problems in the industry, that professionalization?
At that point, AISA only really had around about 2,500 members, sort of 2016 roughly. And it sort of was declining in terms of membership. The biggest sort of financial driver outside of membership dues, because membership dues at that time were, as you remember, was $77. They hadn't changed. Effectively, the other driver was setting up the national conference, which was called the AISA National Conference at that point in time. We got subsequently rebranded it to the Australian Cyber Conference to be more inclusive.
And Ben, I think I would add to this discussion, if you even dial the clock back a little bit further into whatever it was, 2014, 2015, I can't tell you the exact year, but the Commonwealth government decided, to sponsor growth centers, one of which was going to be focused on cybersecurity, and they started consultations at that process to figure out what they needed to do to, build the industry. And, when the discussion came up as to, and it quickly did, in terms of skills and capability and so forth, the discussion turned to, well, sort of how would we go about, building the industry and people's skills. And that was the initial discussion at that first consultation that I attended at the time as an EY partner. I think I attended as an ISACA board member, I correct myself there. And we sort of looked around at each other and said, well, you would reach out to the existing organizations that have already been serving in this space for many years, like ISACA, AISA, IC squared, and there are people around the room in that consultation, and it was met with a quizzingly kind of a look, like they didn't know that we existed or who we were. And it sort of showed sort of a genesis of this stuff in the industry. The people that were starting these discussions really didn't understand the industry at all. They had not come from this cybersecurity space or related direct space. They were, maybe had some IT or other background or whatever, but they really didn't understand who we were. And that was, and I walked away from that first discussion thinking, that's interesting. They don't know who we are.
Yeah. And if you think about it, 2016 was a very different environment. People weren't talking cyber; it was all information security at that point in time. And there was
the cyber was just getting to be cyber.
It was just starting. It was a dirty word at that time.
Much to everyone's annoyance. Yeah.
So it was a very different, population size in terms of people working in the sector. AISA was a very different organization at that point in time. There wasn't the structure that we put in place post 2016. So from 2017 sort of onwards. And you think about how inclusive the Australian Cyber Conference is. It covers a whole range of things from, policy, risk, through to sort of other sort of cybersecurity areas, also focused on small to medium businesses. Whereas, the AISA National Conference at the time was really a collection of sort of members coming together to kind of celebrate cybersecurity and learn new things.
Understood. And so, Damien, why was this initiative abandoned ultimately? It was going to make money for AISA. And so why did you, in the end, decide to walk away from this? And when I say you, I mean the organization.
Yeah, so at AISA, so 2016, it was realized that it's actually going to be a lot of work to actually build a professionalization sort of accreditation model. There would be potential resistance within the community because at that stage there were already some well-established cybersecurity or information security at that time accreditation. So you think of the ISACA, the CISM, the CISSP, from the IC squared. So there was already well-established sort of certification sort of exams that you could undertake. So was there value in PEXA really building another certification system? Then sort of the thought was, well, would it lean more towards an educational kind of aspect for the Australian market? And then again, you hit the problem of, why are we building something in Australia when really we should have an international sort of kind of viewpoint? So, and then you had the challenges that AISA sort of went through in 2016, and then sort of new sort of leadership structure that we moved into in 2017.
Thank you. And so as I was doing my research, I sort of saw that there were no really documents publicly that I could find between 2016 and 2021. It seemed that in 2021, the topic came up again. Before we get to 2021, what happened in between? Was professionalization still part of the discussion, or had people just moved on from it?
So we know that the Australian Computer Society were looking at building out a professionalisation system for cybersecurity.
Right.
Again, that was another mechanism for another association body to try and pick up cybersecurity and in effect, I guess, displace AISA to a degree. AISA kind of watched and observed sort of that model and what kind of uptake that model was likely to really sort of reach, and whether that would be a threat to AISA as an organisation or not. And then it wasn't really until sort of the advent of all the new sort of cybersecurity strategies that people started talking about professionalisation again. And really, it comes back to a fundamental problem of what are we trying to solve? What does professionalisation fix that might be broken or might not be broken in the Australian ecosystem? So you've got, very powerful lobbying bodies that say we should have people that have a cybersecurity accreditation of some sort, whether that's a CompTIA, an ISACA, an IC squared, etc. And in that space, there's over 400 industry certifications you can get from a cybersecurity perspective. So the kind of question started to be raised of, well, what is the ultimate cybersecurity certification that somebody should have to prove that they're a professional or have a minimum level of understanding? And then we started to see sort of challenges emerge where some people don't have any industry certifications because they've come from a traditional academic background. And so is it enough to have people with cybersecurity degrees from the various universities across Australia? And then you look at that and you go, well, actually, there are some people in the sector that don't even have those, but they're at the top of their game in terms of cybersecurity. So it kind of really raises a question of, do we need to have a professionalisation in our sector at this point in time, or back in 2021? We know that there are other parties that were agitating for it. So if you look at Engineers Australia, they very clearly want to have a cybersecurity engineer classification, because then that sort of helps to expand again sort of the Engineer Australia sort of support base as well. So there's different sort of views and opinions as to why we should have professionalisation, and there's pros and cons against each of those as well.
And I guess I'd add to that. Well, Damien and myself participated in the consultation for the cybersecurity strategy in 2020, and that identified, two issues. One, a lack of enough skilled people. Of course, that's an ongoing kind of an issue running, and then trust of those individuals, and should they be trusted. That was what was in the strategy. In the consultation sessions that we sat through, it wasn't a big part of the discussion. The reality, it was much more of a discussion of what are the skills, how do we know what the skills are,
Yep.
And there was a lot of discussion about, should we create our own set of, Australian standards and whatever. And it was interesting because it was driven, quite a bit of discussion was driven by, the parts of the government that you would think of, defense, home affairs, the people that want heavier, more rigorous stuff, the universities, but obvious because they want to come up with some kind of way to create their programs and their curricula and whatever. And then sort of everyone else sort of looking quizzingly and at the time AISA saying, well, why can't we just point to an international standard like the NICE standards and say that's what we should be aiming for, as a guide. And so when the strategy came out, it was a bit of a surprise that was like the only two elements that really sort of hit, sort of directly on that. as an issue. And then, of course, COVID hit and everyone got very distracted.
And you think about sort of that period, 2021, sort of there was a huge demand for cybersecurity professionals. And so everybody was trying to work out, well, what does a cybersecurity professional look like? You had different roles, you had different functions, and it became very complex to kind of understand, well, what are the skills that somebody needs if you're going to be called a cybersecurity sort of professional? If you take a professional not to be an accreditation scheme, but just as an individual, are you somebody that has penetration testing and vulnerability testing skills? Are you from a coding background? Are you from a leadership background? Are you from a audit risk and assessment aspect with a cybersecurity bent on it? Are you a designer of infrastructure and networks and how they connect, or an architect? So it started to fracture into all these different areas, and humans naturally like to put things into boxes, and so we all try to sort of say, well, what does a security architect look like? What are the skills that a security architect should display or have? And so I think people often kind of use we need to have professionalization or standardization of what a professional is in Australia, because you kind of think back to the whole, pink backs, sort of insulation sort of issues that we had in the past where, anybody could install pink backs into a ceiling. There wasn't really a program to train people on safety and making sure that people didn't make mistakes and cause fires and sort of injure themselves and die. And so I think there was a little bit of that thinking from that sort of pink backs era of the Rudd Gillard sort of government around, do we need to have some sort of minimum level benchmark to say that somebody who's talking on cybersecurity knows what they're talking about? Or is somebody who is a trusted individual? And there's other ways to do that without necessarily needing to have a professionalization scheme. We have AUSCHECK in the country, so maybe cybersecurity people should have an AUSCHECK background, because in that way, it's a test that's looking at your police sort of background check character. It's also testing against, are you part of any terrorist organizations? Are you on an AISA watch list and all that kind of stuff? Maybe that could be enough to satisfy that you're a trusted individual from that perspective. A bit like a working with children's check.
Thank you. So as we venture into 2021, there's one document, and it's the only document I found where AISA has some verbiage that recommends professionalization. And this document has 3 names on it. It's got Damien, Mike, and a gentleman called Tony Visa. And I thought this document was significant because I want to say again, it is the only time that I could find where AISA actually said to the government, professionalization is a good idea and we recommend it. However, if we look at the text in detail, there seems to be paragraphs that contradict each other. So I was left under the impression that the authors of these documents struggled to agree on a shared view on this. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
So the genesis of the document would be Tony. So Tony's view of professionalization at that point in time was really primarily based around certifications, so industry certifications. So think of, ISC squared, so CISP being sort of, the gold standard type thing. I had a look at it because, from an academic sort of background, having worked in academia, knowing that not everybody, goes out and gets certifications. I did a crazy thing and I got about 13 different industry certifications, and it was mainly, as a joke kind of thing to prove that, that they're not that difficult to obtain necessarily. At that point in time, things have changed since then. And then, looking at it from an academic lens perspective, academia teaches people how to think. And it's that sort of curiosity and the mechanisms by which you're kind of thinking and addressing sort of problems. And so I felt that Tony's document needed to have also be inclusive for people who don't, have industry certifications, but might have a tertiary background in cybersecurity, would need to be included if you were going down that sort of professionalization sort of path. So I added that component into Tony's document, but I'll let Mike also sort of talk to sort of the genesis of the document as well.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that, you know, if you sort of trace the arc back to, you know, 2014, 15, whatever, we're on this, you know, journey um, in the industry, and it was, you know, different folks along the way were, you know, promoting the idea of professionalization for whatever, you know, their individual organizations' reasons were, but also that this strategy and the government's influence in trying to, you know, grow industry and, you know, provide guidance and improve cybersecurity and look at it from, you know, a national security perspective as well as an industry economic, you know, kind of a question. That this was getting to be, you know, there was sort of this slow, steady drumbeat of, you know, should we have professionalization? And so you know, there was something that was being asked for, and AISA as a, you know, peak body in security space, you know, also, you know, we sort of believe as an obligation we should be informing this and utilizing the information from our members and try to represent the membership and, you know, a little bit more of the grassroots, you might call it, kind of perspectives on this. And you look at other kinds of mechanisms that have started in the Commonwealth, whether it's IRAP or CREST or whatever. One of the reasons they have not been as successful as they could have been is they didn't start with any kind of a grassroots stuff. It was something that was sort of a cram down on people, and the, you know, parties, you know, operating, administering these things were not really sorted to the optimal way that they could have been to encourage the success of them. And so the last thing we need is yet another mechanism where people sort of scratch their head and go, is this really satisfying what we need here, or is it actually creating problems for us? And so I think from an AISA perspective, we were trying to, you know, do some of that informing as part of the communications and white papers. And as I recall, Damien, I mean, you might remember better, but I think we did 3 different surveys along the way asking members and asked this question as part of membership surveys to try to get a read on this. And it was a consistent story. And never, you know, but I think by the time that published paper came out, it had just gotten up to 50%. There's a skepticism that's out there about the need for this, the value for it.
Yeah.
And, you know, AISA wasn't promoting it, although it was, I think, viewed by many people that we were promoting it. But we were actually just trying to listen.
And I think to Tony's credit, you know, if you had gone with the original model, which was purely just industry certifications, you know, again, it would have just been an amplification for those sort of bodies of pushing forward, I guess, you know, selling their certification methodologies. But he listened to what I wanted to add into that paper, which was, well, it's not just about people having industry certifications. You've got to be inclusive of people that have tertiary education. And then you've got to think about a mechanism for people that don't have either of those, that are in the industry currently, that have 10, 15, 20 years of information cybersecurity professionalized sort of experience already. And then the other aspect you've got to think about is just because say you create a professionalized sort of stream, just because you're a professional in cybersecurity under whatever that scheme is, doesn't mean necessarily that you're an expert in an area, because you might be a professional from a tech perspective. That doesn't mean you can suddenly become a CISO because you're a professional, because you lack the leadership skills or maybe an understanding of business finances and all those kinds of aspects. And vice versa. You know, if you're a professional as a CISO, doesn't mean you can suddenly go and pick up and be on the tools. So it kind of then, you know, came back to that point of you would need to structure a professionalization system that had different streams and different tiers within those streams, which gets very, very complex very quickly.
Thank you. So that takes us to 2022, where there was at least one survey that was done, and then the results were published. Now, before we go into the results of this survey, I'd like to understand what prompted AISA to want to do such a survey. And one of the things I couldn't find in this survey was the number of respondents. So I'd like to understand a bit what brought about this survey, what was the methodology that was used, and then we can go into the results.
So the government had decided in the strategy that professionalisation was something that needed to go forward with, counter to, I guess, sort of what AISA might have been saying at the time. There are other people that sort of lobby government to say this is something that is needed, that the sector needs to mature, and this is one way to sort of indicate that it has matured. And so there was an inevitability that the government was going to fund at the time AISA to build out a professionalisation stream. And so as part of informing that, we felt because we sort of represent the industry, we needed to do an assessment, and quite a fairly detailed one, which we broke into two different sort of parts. One was looking at individuals to find out, as a cybersecurity professional in the industry currently, do you have any industry certifications? And if you do, what are they? Do you have tertiary education? And if you do, what does it look like? Or do you have sort of neither of those? And then we also spent time interviewing CISOs in the industry to get an understanding of what are they looking for in terms of employment. Like, could a professionalisation scheme make employment easier for them or harder, or do they really not care about professionalisation at all? And so we were kind of looking at it from two different perspectives. One, which was those that are going to employ people, so the demand side, so people that they're looking to sort of find professionals. And then we looked at the supply side, which was academia and also sort of industry certifications, and understanding our members, what mix do they come from in terms of those sort of three categories. Are you somebody that has industry certs? Are you somebody that's got a tertiary background in it, or have you got neither of those? And you found yourself, based on skill sets from another role, that was able to sort of get you into cybersecurity.
Understood. And so how many people actually participated in this research? How many respondents were there to the surveys or the survey?
I'd have to go back and have a look, but it was a very high percentage of the membership base that responded to the survey. And also when you look at our membership base, you've got a mixture of people that are from an engineering background, a design background, architecture. You've got some that come from academia, as well as some that are cybersecurity leaders as well. So it's a very diverse membership base that we surveyed across. Okay.
And if we request to find out the number of respondents, there would be that information stored somewhere in the historical records?
Hopefully AISA will still have that, depending on whether that platform, they may have purged all the data since then, because that data would contain all the information from sort of every respondent, because the way that the survey was conducted was with tracking. So you've got the ability to resend messages again to those that haven't responded to the survey. So it could be that AISA's already sort of purged that information.
Okay, I'll see if I can find out. So what were the key findings of this survey? What was discovered?
So if you look at the demand side, which is those employing people, the interesting fact to them, the most important thing when they employ somebody in cybersecurity is not industry certifications, not your education background from a tertiary perspective, but the aptitude and attitude of the individual. And that's the thing that they were looking for when they employ somebody. So it doesn't matter if you've got 10 industry certifications, you've got a PhD in cybersecurity, they're not interested in that. The response from the demand side was, if we can find people with the right aptitude and attitude, we can train them on the skills that we need for the business. And so when you think about that, that's a pretty significant statement from that market segment, because they're the ones that are really employing everybody from a cybersecurity perspective. To balance that, we do also see at that time a trend where it was easier, and this could be a problem not with the demand side necessarily for those employing, but maybe for the employment agencies that are working on their behalf of trying to fill those vacancies and roles. it's easy for them to put a job ad up and say, you must have 10 years experience in blah, and you must be CISP certified or CISM certified, etc., or Security Plus certified, because that acts as a quick gateway to reduce the thousands of CVs down to a few hundred CVs that then they might sort of get in contact with and have a conversation to actually understand the aptitude and attitude to then put them forward to the various sort of sizes or those that are looking to employ people in cybersecurity. So there's a bit of a problem there. And because of that, it's often easier for companies to poach people that are known quantities from other organizations because they've effectively been road tested, if you like, in cybersecurity. So they've shown that they can, talk business language or talk technical language, and they've obviously got a cultural fit for that business. It's a less risky proposition to employ somebody by poaching them who's already in cyber than to take somebody who's fresh off the street, if you like, that may or may not have industry certifications, tertiary background, etc.
Yeah, I guess I would add to it, and as a someone coming from America with a different experience, a bigger market, more competitive, deeper economy, all that kind of stuff. I noted, coming here, there really was quite a difference between, what I saw in what we'll call the professional space. In other words, people that are selling a service, into a market, like the big four, big consulting firms, boutique cybersecurity organizations, and what was actually happening more broadly across industry. To Damien's comment about, hiring something that's been already tested and proven on some level from industry, or pulling someone out of the consulting space. And, from the consulting, perspective, always have supported professionalization, and we had to make judgments on what are the gold standards. Is it CISP, is it CISA, is it CISM, in the case of security testing, OSCP, things like that you could point to and say these are generally good barometers or markers, and it's something we could represent with some credibility into the industry. But the big firms generally are doing exactly what Damien had said earlier in terms of they're looking for some base credentials before they're hiring, but they're really, really concerned about mindset and aptitude and all that kind of stuff because they are going to train people, right? So they're coming at the problem from a different perspective. They're starting with the raw material and trying to develop it, if you will, versus industry, which is generally just trying to pull people in. And they don't have the intention to support training and development and conferences and all that stuff to the same level as the consulting space, will do, because it's part of building their supply chain in a much more significant way. So it's the shape of the market here, I think, is also part of what the issue is, where you have, whatever 85% of the market, small business, and you have a group of, a couple layers of very significant companies that have the size and the capability to do those kinds of investments. And so there's quite a jaggedy space in between. And I think that's one of the things that people are struggling with is the market. How do we deal with that problem? If you go to, let's say, any of the big four banks, they know what they're hiring, right? They're sophisticated enough. They have, large numbers of people. When I came to Australia, I had 37 security people at NAB, which is a shocking number. If you think about it now there's probably 3,000 in security at NAB, probably something like that. I don't know what the actual head count is now, where people have security as a substantial part of their job. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a very different world now. Yeah.
It is. And to put into context, like if you look at the US environment, the US Department of Defense brought in a rule that was basically, if you handle sensitive data, you must have at a minimum, and this was a mechanism that the US took, you must have as a minimum a particular cybersecurity industry credential. So you've either got, a Security Plus, you might have a couple other ones, that was the bare sort of minimum. And so you saw this massive rush of everybody in the US trying to get industry certifications, whether it was a CISP, a CompTIA 1, an ISC Squared 1, or an ISACA 1. And that kind of became the de facto mechanism at which that was your minimum bar. It didn't matter if you had a tertiary education in cyber, didn't cut it. And so they looked at it at a very simplistic level of, if you want to have access to information or handle information as part of your job, you need to at a minimum display an understanding, and we're going to check that by saying you've got these industry certifications. Is that the right model for Australia? Who knows? And because it's a complex thing, because one of the findings through, coming back to your original question around what were some of the findings, we found that if we went down a professionalisation path, and depending on how that path is assessed, you're going to potentially disadvantage women. So women are less likely to have an industry certification like a CISP or a Security Plus or a CISM. They're more likely to have tertiary education.
Right.
And then sort of, when you think about some of the people that are already in our sector that don't have either of those two things, I know of a lot of fantastic people in the cybersecurity industry that have come out of humanities subjects. They've come out of music. They've come out of nursing because they understand, triage and crisis management. We've even in our industry got people who've come across from, being chefs. There's a guy that I introduced at one of the Australian Cyber Conference who, started his career as a chef, and, we've kind of nicknamed him the Cyber Chef, who's now working actively in cybersecurity. And so we're quite a fortunate, lucky sector where we need this diversity of thought and this diversity of people to come in and help sort of fight against the bad guys. There is a danger where if we all look the same, think the same, and act the same, we will be outclassed by, the cyber criminals who don't all think the same and act the same and look the same. So that's some of the challenges that, there is a danger with professionalisation of the sector that we could head down that path. If you're looking at somebody who's doing cybersecurity education and awareness in a company, do they need to be a cybersecurity professional if there's a professionalisation standard, or is it better for them to be an educator that knows how to adjust the messaging that is in tune with the people of the business so that it can, be most effective? If you have somebody who's a SOC analyst, do they need to be a cybersecurity professional by that sort of, strict definition, when, people that make really good SOC analysts tend to be people who come from a neurodiverse background? And so, there again, we have a complex problem where if you're a neurodivergent individual, you're unlikely to have a tertiary education because they struggle in our current system in terms of the education, because it's not designed for people who are neurodivergent. But yet they're fantastic at pattern recognition and seeing things that people can't see. And so they're best placed to work in sort of SOCs, for an example.
And I guess I would just underline the two aspects that Damien highlighted, women in security. And, we've spent a lot of time at AISA, talking about it. And, and I have throughout my whole career. And the number one issue that I've heard again and again for women in security is confidence. And the question is, will this actually contribute to helping with that issue, or will it work against it? Will it throw another roadblock out there that will make that confidence issue be impacted again and discourage more women from entering the sector? And to the aspects of encouraging neurodivergent people in the community, absolutely, we found that a lot, particularly in the security testing area. We would find people that couldn't complete high school, and we had to help them get their high school equivalencies. And if you talk to people in the universities, some of them will say we actually wouldn't have a group of people in cybersecurity if we didn't help them through those aspects of their journey. And so, these aren't these aren't minor challenges. They're important challenges in the industry. And again, any kind of a scheme that comes up with it has to deal with those things and somehow support that. And and the question is, by just throwing down a bunch of high bar requirements, are you helping or hurting? Would it be better to take the money and put it towards more TAFE courses, as an example, or putting it into the education sector in high schools and providing that kind of training and development, for kids really early on, including women.
Thank you for adding that, Mike. I want to add a point of clarification. Damien referred to the DoD 8570. That was a baseline where certain providers were shortlisted. Since then, the US DoD CIO has realized that this baseline has essentially failed, meaning that people got the credentials but did not have the skills. And they are now moving to 8140, where they're trying to use a skills-based framework that's a fork of NIST-NICE. And it remains an open question as to whether it will work or not, or whether it will be captured again by the big certification bodies. So I just wanted to mention that clearly. One thing I'd like to point out in this survey is there was a fascinating finding that, and I apologize if I get the numbers wrong, but I think something like 74, 75% of those who are in favor of professionalization work in academia or something like that. Can you tell us about that?
Academics are fantastic. So the way that academia works is it's a very regimented, it's a very structured sort of environment. And so, the whole process of academia to, gain sort of status within academia, the ultimate thing is you become a professor, and so there's this whole sort of process of, you've got to do your studies first, you do your honors, you do your masters, you go from masters to PhD. So they're very used to this kind of structured sort of process. And that's why academics are in favor of a credentialized system, because it gives them something that they can aim for to then sort of obtain. Doesn't necessarily mean that if they get that they're experts to work in industry and solve problems, because they come from a different perspective, which is looking at problems from a theoretical or a research perspective and looking at sort of novel and innovative ways, which might be incompatible, for example, in a ASX listed organization that needs to get a problem resolved today, as opposed to something that is farmed out to PhD students to sort of work on and sort of resolve over a 3-4 year period. So I think comparing sort of, and that was the important aspect, to look at where did people come from that were putting a view forward, because depending on your background, you might be more inclined to say, I'm supportive of a scheme that does this, versus somebody that comes from, the leadership side of cybersecurity, or somebody that comes from another portion of the sort of ecosystem, if you like. So I'm not surprised with academics being supportive, because it's their background in terms of how they function within academia.
Yes. Now, what's fascinating is, as I did this research, what I found is that after the survey had been published, I called this phase AISA Fights Back, meaning that every subsequent paper, AISA is raising the risks of professionalization. It's not saying don't do it, but it's pointing out the problems that have to be solved for this to work. And all the concerns that have been captured by the membership through the survey, through discussions, through people raising concerns. And so I would really like to encourage AISA members to, one, read the survey, but don't stop there. Read the documents that come after that, because they provide even more in-depth analysis as to what the concerns are from the membership. I'm conscious of time. The next item I would like to tackle is the cyber strategy. The government went out in 2023, put a call for the industry to advise them what to do. And there was a question in there that opened the door for every respondent to advocate or recommend professionalization. As I did my research, I found only 6 organizations that did. I wrote an essay about this. It's the ACS and many others. But AISA did not recommend it. AISA raised the risks. And I thought that was fascinating. But then shortly after that, Ost Cyber put together a working group of sorts to design a credential or accreditation. So tell me about what that was, how that came about, and what was the goal of this?
So effectively in the cybersecurity strategy, funding was put aside to introduce professionalisation of the sector. And that money was then given to Ost Cyber at that time to look at how they could solve the problem and to work with the Tech Council of Australia, AISA, work with the Australian Computer Society and some other sort of people as well. So, Jill Slay, Tony Visa, so they were there as well, representing sort of different organisations to work out what's the best way forward. If we were to professionalise, what would it look like? So AISA was kind of, if you like, had no option but to participate. We were actually participating from around about before October 2022, unknown to a lot of other people. So this was happening behind the scenes in Canberra. There was a meeting even in September 28th, which I remember attending, which was the first sort of kickoff meeting of this group, which was called the ACSP sort of design under Ost Cyber at the time. And effectively, we were under NDA where we could not discuss outside of those meetings with the broader membership what was actually happening and sort of the things that we're going through. It got to a point where they wanted to make a public announcement, which would sort of imply AISA's support of professionalisation, whereas we felt we needed to be there to be the voice of the members and highlight sort of the risks and challenges, because even within our membership, we have some that support it and some that don't support it. And so we felt it was important for us to give that balanced view. In the end, it got to a point where another major association pulled out silently. AISA made a media, from my memory serves me correctly, made a media statement saying that we were withdrawing from the program. The reason was it became very clear that there was no way that you could create a professionalised system in Australia that would be independent and stay pure to the mission, if you like, of whatever problem they're trying to solve, because you would have to end up having the consumer paying the cost, or you'd have to get vendors to help sponsor the accrediting body, which then starts to lead into issues of conflict of interest. If you have certification bodies that are acting as sponsors of an accreditation program in Australia, is it still achieving the mission that it was meant to be achieving? And still nobody to this date can tell me what problem we're trying to solve with accreditation. And so it really became clear that the cost to the consumer would be in excess of $700 to become a certified cybersecurity professional. That brings with it a whole range of other things where now you are publicly liable for being sued. So you need to have indemnity insurance, which under your professionalisation membership fee, say for example, if you had to pay that to AISA or some other accrediting body, would cover your sort of insurance costs. But over time you could expect that could increase, because you start to then create an environment where cybersecurity professionals individually could be sued by their organizations for breaches or failures, which obviously would drive up indemnity fees. So same sort of problem that we're having in the medical sector, where a lot of the doctors are complaining that it's unaffordable for them to do bulk billing because they can't afford the indemnity fees anymore and things like that. So fast forward 20 years, could that be where we end up? Maybe. But it was very clear that you couldn't have a body that could really assess somebody based on the complexity of whether they're a technical person, whether they're in the leadership or another space within cybersecurity, whether the accreditation is based on job experience, And so you have to answer and go through an interview process and all that kind of stuff, whether it's based on your university degree or masters that you might have, or purely just industry certifications. And so if you look at all of that together, it becomes very expensive to say, well, how do I assess if somebody is fit to meet whatever benchmark I create? And so that becomes an expensive proposition.
And I guess I would just add is that as part of that journey, as a perspective as a board member at AISA, the fact that that initiative was done under NDA in the fashion that it was, to me as a board member, it became an untenable situation. If we can't have transparency and share information at a board level, at a membership level, and so forth, then we're not fulfilling our obligations to the membership. And it seemed to me the better way, aside from some of the issues that Damien raised, is to step away from an activity like that, because it's just programmed for failure. The Royal Commission into RoboVet came up with findings that included it was necessary to bring the outside in before forming policy and doing things like that. It's a very similar kind of a situation. We're not, despite the fact that many will represent that we've been consulted, we haven't as an industry. And so, this is something being done to us, and Ben, you highlighted some of the other organizations that have made submissions in addition to AISA, where AISA sort of stood up for the industry. And you really look at them and you say, well, hang on, what's been their contribution in this space to the industry? And, I could say, as someone that came to Australia and has been here for 20 years, I would say nil is likely the answer for most of them. And that they haven't, they may have done, individual things to, make contributions in some kinds of ways. But for me, as a professional and someone working in this space, there's been no benefit to me from them. So I'm skeptical as to why are they there, and then you go back to whatever the self-interests are, and everybody, me, both of you guys, we all come to the party with self-interest, and you have to declare those interests and be honest about them and offer transparency. And so as whatever this pilot goes forward, those should be, essential principles of it, that, because otherwise it's just going to be another, failed activity.
And I want to add an important point of clarification for those listening to us. As I've been researching this topic, Damien, you've been portrayed as somebody who's been working behind the scenes, making captain scores to prevent professionalization from going ahead, that you have somehow misrepresented the survey and many people did not respond to this survey. I just want to give you the opportunity, Damien, to respond to these accusations that are being done behind your back about this.
If I haven't been on social media looking at any of those things, so if that's what's going on, that's quite disappointing, because what we were trying to do was ensure that people had the facts and the information at the time, and remove, to Mike's point, the lobbyist perspective that people have come in with biases to say, actually, we should all professionalize and use these industry certifications. If you think about the richness of our collective group that makes up cybersecurity people in Australia, people come from various backgrounds, and it's very important that we understand and recognize that at a time where we need more people in cybersecurity. Why are we putting up barriers to reduce people coming into the sector? Why are we trying to drive up costs for both, the end user, that's a cybersecurity, person in the sector, and businesses as well? And so, I bring it back to the fundamental thing of what problem does cyber professionalization solve for us? And no one's really been able to answer that to date. Everybody points to things like, to be an electrician, you need to be a registered electrician. To be a doctor, you need to be a registered doctor. Well, we see the sort of problems that are happening in that space where we can't get enough doctors. Just because you're a registered plumber or an electrician doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do a good job. It just means that, yes, you've gone through some training from a safety perspective. You understand, the things that you might need to do from a plumbing perspective or an electrical perspective, but it doesn't mean that you're if you translate that to cyber, it doesn't necessarily mean a minimum benchmark. Unless you have a robust process where people can report, somebody came and did some work and burnt my house down, so now they're deregistered and they can't ever operate again, kind of thing. And so, are we going to have that kind of system? I've worked with CompTIA for over 25 years, and for those who sort of are not aware, CompTIA they're one of the largest certification bodies overseas. They were not for profit up until just recently, which I believe they've been sort of acquired by another entity. And so I have a very deep understanding of the process that goes through to build these certifications, and sort of the testing that goes on, and sort of the things that happen in certain countries where people try to subvert the system and stuff like that as well. So certification gives a great check mark in terms of you meet this minimum benchmark, but that was a point in time. So, I passed the CISP exam 20 odd years ago. If I did the CISP exam tomorrow, even though I'm a certified, CISP, that doesn't necessarily mean that I would know how to pass that exam, because that has changed radically in 20 years. 20 years ago, we weren't talking about AI systems and those kinds of threats and things like that. So, people in the certification industry will argue, well, that's why you have continued professional development points that you have to accrue every 3 years to prove that you can still be certified to hold that certification. Some call it continued professional development or continued professional education points. But at the end of the day, you need to build a system that is fairly robust if you're going to go down the path of professionalisation, that doesn't penalise people, and that can still ensure we have, the richness of different backgrounds coming into our sector. Is cybersecurity a mature sector? I think we've got a lot more evolution to go through. Just look at the technology changes that's happened. SOC analyst positions used to be the number one thing that everybody said you should, try and get into. That's going to be rapidly replaced by AI and automation type aspect at a SOC level 1 analyst type thing. What's the next role that we're going to have in cybersecurity, or the next roles? We don't know. And so this is a constantly changing and evolving, whereas, plumbing and electrical that have registered things, how often does your plumbing system change from a technology perspective? Not really.
And I guess I would just add to, Ben, your question about, Damien. I would hope that, going forward, we don't have more of that kind of, activity in the community. It's one of the things that I think as a community we have to be very conscious of, that we're not denigrating each other's skills or capabilities or our motivations. We really should be, supporting each other. I think it's important that the dialogue, whatever it is or whatever the scheme is, that activity, the pilot that goes forward, that's a key focus. And as the Prime Minister said on election night, in Australia, we should treat each other with respect. And I think that's something that's really important. People at AISA, the board members, we do this, and you're doing what you're doing as a volunteer. There's a lot of volunteer activities put into the sector that go unrecognized. And I think, whether it's from the government's perspective or the broader community perspective, we need to recognize those contributions are significant and they come at great, effort. And so if I take someone like Damien, I'll just say, he's contributed to the industry for, 9 years as a board member, but longer than that. He should be, sort of respected and valued for his contributions. It shouldn't be a case where we're doing a tear down.
And I've always tried to.
It's not right. It's just not right.
And I've always tried to take the approach of everybody's going to have a different view and perspective. And so AISA as an organization needs to have that balanced approach of we're going to have some members that are supportive of it, and we're going to have some members that are against it, and then we're going to have a portion that are undecided. And so you have to come to it with no bias. Like I was able to bring to it my background in academia, my background in developing certifications and exams, my background in working in sort of the industry for 25 plus years and having, 13 odd sort of certifications from the past. And so using that, I wasn't funded by any organization. I didn't work for AISA. I'm a volunteer for CompTIA. I wasn't pushing an agenda. Mine was, can we answer why we are doing this? And if we can, great. Okay, how do we best solve for it that still enables a richness within our community? And how do we ensure that we're not creating barriers that prevent women from also entering the sector? So, at the time when we looked at the AISA membership base, 17% of women in the sector is a very low number. If we could get it to 40 or 50%, that'd be something to celebrate. And so, there was a lot of people that were pushing to say, we need to have professionalisation because we're very important and key individuals to organisations. And my response would be to that, well, we don't force company directors on boards to become certified company directors. There's nothing that exists as a professionalisation. The Australian Institute of Company Directors has a fantastic course for company directors that shows that you have a broad understanding of risk management, financial management, and sort of, an understanding of the kinds of things that you need to look at as a company director. But there's nothing mandated that says you need to be, a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors to become a board director. And so, I think we get into very dangerous territory where we start to mandate minimum standards like that. Could you say, maybe the easiest thing would have been to say, look, we should have all done AusCheck backgrounds to make sure that we're not criminals moonlighting, that then sort of, is that trusted insider in an organisation that's in a privileged position. That's fine, because that's looking at, are you involved in organised crime? Do you have links to terrorist organisations? All that kind of stuff. No problem with that. But then, to say you must meet a minimum benchmark to be called a cyber professional, that's a very different proposition.
And for those listening, I'd like to stress one more time that many of us, including some of the proponents of professionalization, are doing this on a volunteer basis. And we're doing it out of our convictions. We might not disagree. Well, we might disagree about some crucial aspects. However, it's important that we remain respectful and that we look at ourselves from a humanistic way. And I want to say that if I put myself in your shoes, Damien and Mike, you have a membership at AISA, or you had a membership that was split on this issue.
Yes. Yep.
And so that would have made your own position very complicated, because any statement you might make would maybe disappoint half the membership and please the other half. And so I'd like to just remind that whoever plays the professionalization discussion game, whatever they put out, they are putting themselves out in terms of maybe upsetting a number of people who are either for or against. And so that should really drive us to be as respectful as we can be while speaking the truth that we most believe in. So we've gone a little bit over time. I really want to thank you both for the discussion today. And I'd like to just close with a thought that Mike has left me a few weeks ago when we met in person. He essentially really reinforced to me the idea that we should all ask ourselves, how can we be helpful to AISA? What can we do to help the board, help the members? And I think this answer can be unique for every individual, but that is how I would like to leave this podcast. Let's not go necessarily at war against AISA, but let's ask ourselves, now that we understand a little bit more about the history of professionalization and the difficulty with it all, how can we be helpful to the organization and the country? So once again, thank you both, and I hope to see you in person soon.
Thanks, Benjamin.
Thanks, Ben.